So we're very near to the end of the church's year, close to Advent. And for that reading, this week and next weekend, the readings are about the end of all things, the end of time. The prophet Malachi today is speaking about the day of the Lord, the day of judgment, when a fire will come to purify and to heal, but also to burn away all that is evil. And Jesus is there in the temple, the glory of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. But he's looking up at this beauty and he's prophesying its destruction and speaking really not just about the destruction of the temple or of Jerusalem, but symbolically speaking about the fragility of time itself, how everything will come to an end, and our need to live our lives now in the light of eternity, and not to get caught up in the transient values of the present moment. Most of us, Christians as much as anyone else, we are living day to day without too much reflection, if we're honest, aren't we? We don't think about values very often. We take them for granted. We absorb them from our family and culture more or less uncritically, and we just get on with life. It's got a momentum of its own. And you can come up with your own list of what is important to you. And you can test this by seeing, very simply, what do you give your time to and what do you spend your money on? This isn't deep. Yeah, you don't need psychoanalysis for this. Just look in your wallet and your diary. What do you spend your time on and spend your money on? That is what your values are. What is the list? Well, I know a few students. It's friendship, it's family, it's education, it's your CV, it's your internships, your job, your money, your salary, your leisure, your reputation, your health, your relationships, your love life. The list goes on, but not too long. That's most of it, isn't it? But then something happens that gives you a sudden shake and makes you think, does any of this matter after all? And puts things in perspective. That's what the readings do to us today, and that's what life does to us sometimes, and maybe it's happened to you as young people, maybe you've been spared that kind of shock. It's Remembrance Sunday today, isn't it? And remember the origins of this. It's about the cataclysmic shock of the First World War on Western European culture and civilization. The complacency of everything is fine and we're moving forward and we know what life is about. All of that was torn apart in the First World War, and of course in every war, but for the West in particular then, at the beginning of the 20th century. And there are more personal ways that the shock comes that turns things upside down. Very often it's sickness, isn't it? For ourselves or for those we love. It's grief. It's near-death experiences. And I don't just mean supernatural ones. One of my first near-death experiences was a few weeks after I'd got my driving licence. Yeah? Happy-go-lucky 17-year-old driving off to a party one evening, and I realised afterwards, 50 metres afterwards, that I'd just gone through a red light at a major crossroads. I don't mean I'd seen it turning amber and I decided to jump the amber. I mean I had been daydreaming, I'd gone straight through a red, and I stopped the car after the traffic lights when I was safe, and I just stood there frozen. Really. What would have happened if the car had been coming at 90 degrees through the green? It stayed with... Well, I feel the shock still, yeah? 30 years later, really. It's very strange. But these things make us pause. And actually, a great way in, not all cinema or fiction does this, but apocalyptic science fiction does this for us. This is one of the great gifts of sci-fi. And I'm what are you laughing at? This is truth. I'm fresh from seeing Arrival yesterday. Yeah, you've seen the posters. Has any of you seen it yet? Good. I like to be ahead of the curve. And look, just so you know, I promise you never to give plot spoilers in a film. Right? That's a solemn promise. And my definition of a plot spoiler is anything that happens after 10% of the time into a film. Yeah? So a 130-minute film, I will not speak about anything after 13 minutes. That's my solemn promise to you. So in Arrival, Amy Adams, don't worry, I'm not going to speak for 13 minutes about the first 13 minutes. She's a Portuguese teacher. She's trying to get on with her ordinary life, and 12 alien pods come and place themselves in different parts of the world and sit there. Okay, that's minute 13, I'll stop. But the point of great apocalyptic sci-fi like this is she's trying to live her normal life. Yeah. And there's a lovely scene where she's in a lecture room. There's 200 people outside, and she thinks, well, I'm not going to get caught up in what they're fussing about. I'm going to go and lecture. It's my duty. And she goes into the lecture room, and there's 5 students there. And she begins to lecture, and one by one, their phones start going off. Yeah? And she keeps lecturing. She says, I'm not going to stop. Yeah? And eventually, one of them looks up and says, Miss, do you mind turning the TV on behind you? And she does. And there are the alien pods. Right, okay, minute 13. I'll stop now. But it's this clash between trying to be normal and realising that you can't be. Because something's happened that's relativised all the other things that used to be important to you, like teaching Portuguese to second-year undergraduates. Yeah. That's her little jolt in this very clever film. It's the jolt of the scriptures today, and it's meant to give us a jolt. And that long list of what do you spend your time and money on, if you do stop and think, what are my values? I don't just mean moral values. I mean, what are the things I'm living for? To think today, at the end of the year, do they matter? Some of them do. But what really matters? And importantly, what doesn't matter? This is the Christian tradition of trying to live life in the light of eternity. Of, for example, carrying with us, not in a morbid way, the remembrance of death. Here we are in the middle of the month of November. It's not just to pray for the dead, it's to remember our own death, which we don't know, will it be tonight or in 80 years' time. It's the tradition of having an examination of conscience at the end of every day, so that when we go to bed, we've given the day to God, we've given our life to God, because it might be the last day. It's the lovely tradition in some Catholic countries of having the graveyard around the parish church. Do some of you have that at home? I mean, it's true of English medieval churches. It's true of others. Of French, I remember an Austrian church, yeah? Going to Mass with my Austrian friend and saying, oh, this is where my grandmother's buried. This is where my auntie's buried. That death is a part of life, not in a threatening way, but in a realistic way, that puts life in its true perspective. How do we react then when we get this jolt, this new perspective? Well, two reactions. One reaction, they're both good, sorry, two ways forward. This is what Jesus is saying in the Gospel. One reaction is don't overreact. As in, don't go into existential meltdown and panic, and don't overinterpret. Stay steady. Live the faith you've always been living, but live it with more integrity. The last line of the Gospel today is very simple. It's not very apocalyptic. It's just, your endurance will win you your lives. Just to endure, in the rich, beautiful, positive sense of just to live your faith with integrity each day just to love God and to love your neighbour. And it connects with what we heard in 2 Thessalonians, the letter of St. Paul, where he says, we order and call on people to go on quietly working and earning the food they eat. There's something very simple and uncontroversial at one level about the Christian life. To be a loving person, a good citizen, a faithful husband, wife, daughter, son, father, mother. Perseverance, normality. Normality. I wrote a little booklet some of you have seen called How to be a Young Catholic, a way of life for young Catholics. And one of the chapters about holiness, it is called Be Normal. Yeah? That's pretty boring, isn't it? But just that's part of Christianity. Be normal. This is, if you like, the little way of St. Therese. To do little things with great love. Yeah? Uncomplicated. Very difficult, but uncomplicated. So, the first reaction is don't overreact, but focus. Be conscious of using time well. Be more thoughtful and reflective, but not obsessive. The other reaction, though, also pointed out in the Gospel, is to rethink what we are doing. Because the times, the radical times that we live in, which is what the Gospel is saying, don't just call for normality, they also call for heroism. And sometimes for a revolution in our own lives and our own vocation. As Jesus says, there are times when we need not to step back humbly, but to step out and to step up and to step forward and to bear witness. Not to stay on the back row in obscurity. And there are times, often when we have an existential shake, to ask the Lord if actually he has a different set of values for us. That he has perhaps a more challenging, a more radical direction in life than the one we have been walking down unreflectively for the last few years. Maybe some of the things I have been pursuing are simply not good. They are not good. And I need a moral conversion and a little bit more honesty. But maybe they are good in themselves, but not right for me at this time. Or maybe even they're really good. They're possibly right, but they're not the best thing. And this, as some of you know, is one of St. Ignatius's criteria of discernment. It's not just what's good to do. That's quite easy. Yeah? What's good to do. But it's what is the best thing for me to do. And what is for the greater glory of God. You can live a good life. And I hope that most of you are trying to. We are trying to live a good life. But actually, that's not the final question Jesus will ask us at the end. It's not, did you live a good life? It's, did you live the greatest life possible for you? To give me, God, the greatest possible glory, and for you to become the person that you were called to be, not just the person that you chose to be or wanted to be. They overlap, sure, but they're not exactly the same. And so just to prod you here, this is not a sermon about vocation, but at the end of this end of times sermon, to prod you to think about how discipleship flows into vocation. And encourage you to think not just about what you want, that's an important question, and we should think about it more, but to think about what God is calling you to. And maybe he is calling you to a deeper good and a deeper happiness than what you can see at the moment. I was in Birmingham this week, Now, the students think that I was there to have a midlife crisis and avoid a significant birthday that happened on Tuesday, but that wasn't the reason. I was there because I was giving a talk at the Conference of National Vocations Directors. And the theme of the conference was Discipleship leads to vocation. Discipleship leads to vocation. In other words, if you want to discover your vocation, and if you want to be a good vocations director, the people at this conference, the key is not to be going on about vocation. It's to be going on about following Jesus Christ, being a disciple, wanting to love God and love your neighbour. And if that desire grows, then, this is the scriptures today, out of that will grow a deeper and deeper desire to give your life to the Lord and to follow not just your own path, but the path that Jesus is calling you to. So there's a real and a beautiful challenge here today. First of all, it's to stop and think and reflect, what am I seeking? And that in itself is worthwhile. But to go to the next step and say, not just what am I seeking, but what is God seeking for me?